Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Textile Talk podcast. I'm Gail Cowley, and I'll be your host today. Joining me for this episode is Jude Kingshott. Just to give you a little bit of background on her before we start our chat, Jude is a practicing mixed media artist and tutor. She currently teaches small groups of one or two from her own studio, and also larger groups in both the UK and across Europe. She has exhibited both individually and as part of groups in the UK and in Europe, and has taught masterclasses at the Festival of Quilts, and also worked as the studio manager with Leslie Morgan at Committed to Cloth. Coming from a creative family, she has been making for as long as she can recall. Jude has travelled extensively around the world and lived in several different countries. This has all shaped and enhanced her artistic practice. Excited by all forms of fibre, her creative journey has included quilt making, dyeing, and hand and machine and stitching. Jude's current practice focuses on Japanese shibori techniques with indigo dyeing. She also uses origami techniques with vintage maps, paper, and cloth. Botanical printing on both fabric and paper is also an area of focus for her practice and teaching. Hand stitching will always be her first love, and sometimes it feels like her hands have an inbuilt memory. The outcome of her practice takes the form of wall art, books, and vessels.
So thank you so much, Jude, for agreeing to come onto this podcast. It's so much appreciated.
Thank you for asking me.
Now, it's a pleasure. And I suppose what I'd like to do initially is kick things off by asking you to tell us a bit more about yourself, your background and how you actually came to mixed media and to textiles.
Okay. From a very early age, I've always been a maker. My mother made lots of things. She knitted, she sewed, she did whatever she wanted to do. She made rag rugs, but she did things through necessity. And I think as soon as she could, she stopped doing them. Whereas I absolutely loved making things. So from a very early age, I'd make things for my dolls, and she taught me how to knit. And so I've always embroidered. I've always liked embellishing things. And then in the 70s, I felt it was almost frowned upon that you made things. A lot of my friends sort of, well, that's a bit strange. But I continued. I made clothes, I made curtains, I made lots of things. And then in the early 70s, I went to live in Egypt. My husband
how interesting. Yeah,
yes.
That must have been fascinating from a textile point of view.
But I was very young. I was in my early 20s, and I think I hadn't been quite woken up yet to the creative side of textiles. Anyway, the first thing that happened when I was there was I met an American quilting bee. And of course, I was just blown away. They were making a quilt as a wedding present. And it was just like, how wonderful is this? What a wonderful wedding present. And how wonderful that they were making it all together. It was really, and of course I want to do that. I want to have a go at this. And I was lent a book, and I went away and I chose a pattern, and it was called The Square in the Middle. And of course, Egypt is renowned for its cotton.
Yes.
So I went to the fabric shop and I bought cottons, and I cut out my quilt and I sewed it by hand, because at that point I didn't have a sewing machine. I sewed it by hand, and when I came to putting the wadding in, I couldn't get any. I couldn't get any wadding.
Oh, really?
So
right.
Yeah. It was, and thinking back, I don't know why I didn't ask the American ladies, but I didn't. Anyway, it ended up being a duvet cover. which was, but genuinely, that's what started me off. Then I started thinking about what else could I do. I carried on making quilts, from this book, but then I bought some acrylic paints and I started printing onto these white galabeas that the men wear. So I did it. Then I started stitching onto them. I did some embroidery, and it progressed from there. It was. I was awoke. I was awoken, and I wanted to learn to do a lot more things. Then when we came back to the UK, it's quite hard to think about how the order of things went. I still carried on making things. I made a lot of clothes for the children. By that time, I had 2 children. And then I did City and Guilds creative. I think it was called creative embroidery. And I did it at Guildford with Ruth Collins and Leslie Barnett. And every time something new came up, I was just, I had a lot of what if, and I was always the one who appeared with a bag full of samples that I'd made, and I don't think I was very popular, because I always had I've still got them, actually. They were used for a long time as a teaching aid by Ruth, and then when City and Guilds basically went in Guildford, I got them back, and I can't bring myself to throw them away, so I've got them somewhere. And then carrying on the journey from City and Guilds, I met Leslie Morgan with Committed Cloth, and I did a course with her. I think it was in Rainbow Silks, which is a shop somewhere, halfway up the country, with Procyon dyes. She talked to me about a course that they were running called Wet and Wild, and so that led me into Committed to Cloth. So I went there as a student initially, and then after a while, when Claire decided to step back because she wanted to concentrate on her own journey, Leslie asked me if I would be her studio manager.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
from there, and from there, of course, we brought in a lot of outside tutors. I met some wonderful, completely different courses, not just quilting courses. Matthew Harris came, Alice Fox came, Denise Lack came, Yetta Clover came, and I supported all of them. So
Yes.
I was exposed to all of these people, and it just fired up my interest. And
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's just been, a progression from there. So I started working with Leslie, and one of the things we did was we had the Creative Textile Studio, as it's called now, at Festival of Quilts, but it was called something different then, Virtual Studio. And that's how I met Brunhilde Scheibmeier, who is a German textile artist. And she came to demo. She already knew Claire and Leslie. And in life, sometimes you meet people and everything just clicks, and you just know you're going to get on, and you have similar interests. And that's what happened with her and I. And we started teaching together. I learnt my eco-printing from her, and we have taught together. She ran a studio in Germany, and that's how I started teaching there. When I went to work for Leslie, I said, "Oh, I'm really happy to do this, but I don't want to teach." Yeah, and she said, "No, that's fine." And of course, I did teach.
You just decided that you could do it as well as the people that were in there, I'm sure.
I think it wasn't that I didn't think I was good enough. I just didn't think I'd enjoy it. But actually, I didn't realise what you got out of it when you teach people. I just had no idea. And of course, I was always showing things that I was doing, because I work constantly. I still work constantly. And then one of the students said to me, "Well, I think you should teach this." And I thought, I'm not sure about that. But that's how it started.
It's very satisfying, isn't it? Seeing people that have perhaps come into a class a little bit underconfident and quite
Yeah,
unsure, and then you
yeah.
can sort of see them grow and develop. And it's satisfying in a different way to perhaps doing the same thing yourself.
Yes. The other thing that I soon realised is that everybody gives you something. It's not just you're teaching them; they teach you. They sort of allow you to realise, oh yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that, and
Mm.
that surprised me too. So it's for me, it's always a two-way street. It's and there is nothing as lovely or as satisfying as you say as you get to the end of a course and you can see how happy people are with this
Yes.
making something. It is wonderful, isn't it?
It is. It's very satisfying. And it's also very interesting to hear that one of the first things on your journey was a City and Guilds course, because of course
Yes.
we're very involved in running those here.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's something that, well, I know when I did mine, you look back and you think there's so many different techniques taught on it, so many different
Yeah.
materials used, and it just sort of almost gives you the enthusiasm to go away and try lots of things in a way you
I
wouldn't
think,
if you were
yeah,
just working on your own. Mm.
I think that's the thing about City and Guilds. There's so much scope for the what if. What if
Yes.
I do that? What if I try this? And sometimes I had so many what ifs going on in my head that I didn't have time to do everything that I wanted to do. So I found it fantastic. And I think it's very sad that there's not quite so many options offered now and it's not as popular as it used to be.
No, that's very true. I think certainly, I mean, we have still a lot of students, but it used to be quite easy to go and do it at your local evening class, wherever that was. And it was
Yes.
something that was offered regularly, and that just seems to have come to a complete halt.
Yes, like a lot of adult education stuff, a lot of it is not as big as it used to be, which is sad, isn't it?
I think it is because I mean, sort of looking wider than just textiles. It's almost an admittance, perhaps from the government, although I don't want to get political on it, but it certainly does, I think, stem from funding that
Yes.
when you get to a certain age, that you can't change your mind, that you can't change careers, because that's really what we relied on. If you did want to do something different, then you carried on working and you went to night school, didn't you? And you learned
Yes.
something different.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yes. And also, I think if you left school fairly young, because in my time, my father wasn't, he said, girls just get married. So you have to have something that is practical and, is sensible. So I did a hairdressing apprenticeship. He found me the job. And yet, I wanted to do something else. As far as he was concerned, girls didn't go to college. What was the point?
Yeah.
Which I think is quite sad.
It is sad, and it also, I suppose, shows you what a long way we've come in what's a relatively short time, really.
Yes. Yes. But I still sometimes wonder whether young girls do believe they have lots of options
Mm.
because I have a daughter who's in her 40s and she went to Chelsea. But she genuinely didn't really believe that she could earn money, she could make a career for herself out of textiles.
Mm.
And I found it really interesting because, I didn't give her that message.
No, I wondered. I mean, did you ever get to the bottom of where it did come from? Did you have any idea?
No, no. Well, genuinely, I think some of it came from her father, who did have strong ideas about what was the right thing to do.
Mm.
What almost like my father, what was the sensible thing to do? And during our marriage, I wanted to go to university, but it was quite clear I had to do something sensible. So I did maths. Can you believe that? I
Right.
did maths.
That must have been, pardon me, it must have been very helpful as far as the patchwork side of things is concerned, because that's very useful for patchwork.
I do have a love of maths. I absolutely love maths. And I have to say, I have to put my hand up and say, I stopped making quilts quite quickly.
Oh, right. Well, if you
Because
were, yeah, I was just going to say, if you were doing it by hand, that's such an undertaking, my goodness.
it wasn't that. And I enjoyed the cutting out, and I enjoyed the sewing together, because for me, I had to have a certain amount of rhythm. Like, I would do so many a day. I would cut so many out a day. But I didn't find the end result creative enough. I wanted to always go off piste.
Which is
And
obviously your creative mind is why you
Yes.
have taken that and run with it, and you are where you are today. Because
Yes.
many people don't necessarily, one doesn't always follow on from the other.
I still go to, like, at the Festival of Quilts, I am in awe of what people make quilt-wise. But I know it's not for me now. I just
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to do it. I made all of my grandchildren a quilt. I made a quilt when my daughter got married. So I still made them. Oh, I made a quilt after my mother died. I needed to do something with my hands, and I didn't know what to do. So I made a quilt by hand just to help. And it did help. It did help a lot.
Yes, it's one of the things that I suppose all handwork, it takes your attention, doesn't it, in a way that I'm struggling to think of other things that do, because it's exercising your mind and keeping your hands
Yes.
busy.
And for me, there was always a rhythm to it. As I said, did so many blocks a day, and I actually quilted this quilt by hand. And I needed to make something that was bright and cheerful, because it was just a really difficult time. And every time I see it on the bed, it makes me smile, because I think of my mother.
Yes,
So that's nice.
which is lovely.
Yes.
So where is it that you look for inspiration, Jude? I mean, looking at your work, it seems to be, to me, an awful lot of natural inspiration.
Yes. I love the natural world. Honestly, if I had to put it down to a few things, I don't think I would be able to. I mean, the trees, it shifts sometimes.
Mm.
If I'm eco printing, of course, it's the trees, the leaves, the shapes of the leaves. But I can find inspiration from lyrics, poetry. A lot of my inspiration comes from things that have happened in my life. I do respond creatively to whether they're good, whether they're bad. It always inspires me. I have to make something. It has to reflect what's going on. So it's quite difficult to put it down to any one thing.
I mean, I can certainly imagine that a lot of the dyes that you create, because you do work with natural dyes, don't you?
I used to work a lot with Procyon dyes, and then I started eco printing, and then I started looking at natural dyes and thinking, oh, they're so much softer. And Procyon dyes serve their purpose. So I work with natural dyes, but I know I have a very long way to go. So I can't claim to be an expert.
It's something, I think, because we're all a lot more aware than we used to be of some of the harmful effects that dyeing has to the
Yes.
ecology and to the planet.
Yes.
And I know it's something that a lot of our students and followers are really getting much
Yes.
more interested in, the natural dyeing process. But it's different, isn't it? As you say, you don't get the strength of colour that you do with some of the man-made dyes.
And yet you can get just a bigger palette as you get with matte, but you don't get this brightness immediately. And I think if you make the decision to shift to natural dyes, you have to switch that other part of your head off, because it's taken me quite a long time to get to the point where when I think about dyeing something, I go into Procyon dye mode and thinking, no, that's not how it works. But I think it has all the colours that you can get from Procyon. You just have to go about it a different way and be more patient, which I think is a good thing.
Yes, I'm sure it is. Could you tell us a little bit about the processes involved?
Okay, so I dyed a piece of cloth with madder, and I used madder powder, and it was a piece of cotton, and you have to put tannin on it first, and then you put the mordant on it. So I put gallnut, and then I put alum and soda ash, and then I dyed it with the madder, and I dyed it for an hour, and it's about dye to weight of fabric. So I used quite a lot of madder actually, and then you heat it up, I think it to 60 degrees, stir it for an hour, leave it overnight, and there's your colour.
So you do need to do a lot of thinking ahead, don't you?
You have to, yes, you have to think ahead, and you have to be ready, and you have to be patient, because the thing about Procyon dyes is you can just put them in the bucket, leave them, walk off, and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
But I think you do have to focus. But that's one of the things I actually like. I like this focus. I think as I've got older, I've become much more focused about how I approach things. And I think that's one of the things I like about Japanese stitch resist, is you have to be focused and you have to be
Yes.
disciplined.
Yes, I'm sure that you do. That's very much an interest of yours, isn't it? How did
It
you
is.
come across that?
I've worked with indigo, and again, synthetic indigo, for a very long time. That was actually the first course I taught at Committed Cloth, stitch resist with indigo, and we did dyeing with Procyon prior to that, and then stitch resist. So, and I did a masterclass with Jane Callender a very long time ago, again using synthetic. So I thought, and I put my hand up and say, I thought I knew quite a lot of stuff about stitch resist until I went to Japan. And then I realised I didn't really know a lot about it. Or I felt that it had been westernised. Yeah.
Going to ask you what the difference between the two are. You know, what do you see as the main differences between what we would
Well,
do in the West and what Japan does?
there are small differences. It's like I learned and stitch resist using a bonded thread, a nylon bonded thread, which, apparently gives you a tighter resist, and it does give you a tight resist. And some things like putting a little bit of cotton thread at the end to stop the knot showing, and all sorts of things like that. And you get to Japan and they use cotton thread to resist with, and they put small little squares of fabric. I mean, what they did, when I sat back, made so much more sense. One of the things with using cotton thread is when it's wet, it tightens up.
Yes.
So it tightens up. So if you wet it before you tie it, you get a stronger resist.
Ah, yes. Mm.
So there were small subtleties like that, and I think, I don't know, it just made more sense to me when I saw it being used the way it was being done in Japan.
Mm. And do they use the same fabrics?
Cotton, yes, they use
Yes.
natural fabrics, and of course they use, if they're doing it for kimonos, they would do 12 meters in one go.
Gosh, yeah, that is a
I've
serious
never done
amount.
I've never done 12 meters, and I've only ever made, I don't know, 30 by 30 centimeters. I've made bigger pieces now because I've started going on a different path and thinking, okay, I'll try this now. And I think the samples that I made we never made small samples. They were big samples that took quite a lot of sewing, quite a lot of but it made sense. It all made sense to me.
Do the Japanese work just as one person, or do they work as a team when they're actually creating the resists?
Well, the person that I studied with in Japan, he did an apprenticeship. So I presume they must have worked in groups. I mean, he was working on his own, but they have to work in groups. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense, would it? Everything would be so expensive if you
Yes.
only had one person making 12 meters. And
Well,
of
that's what
course,
I was thinking. I mean, 12 meters is going to take a really long time, isn't it? On
yeah,
your own.
he was very quick.
Was he?
He was quite surprising. I mean, the person that I went with, we know how to sew, and we have sewn and hand sewn quite a lot and done quite a lot of stitch resist. So we thought we were okay. But when I watched him sewing, I was thinking, okay, because he was probably 10 times faster than me, and
Hmm.
he was very skilled with his needle. Very, very, very.
It's interesting that it's a man, isn't it?
Yeah.
We tend to think of it
Yes.
as being, well, I'm not going to say women's work, but I suppose they just have really, but it does tend to be predominantly female orientated. But presumably he was full time as well, so he was earning his living in that way.
Yes. Yes. But we did meet women who did resist. When you think of, like, in Aramatsu, the women, there are women, but they only ever specialize in one technique. So they do one technique, whereas Taka wanted to learn as many as he could. And again, if you watch the women doing it, and they're usually elderly women, we didn't see any young women doing it, they are so fast and
Hmm.
so skilled. And I bought one of these machines. We call it a machine, but it's not really a machine. It's got a needle on the end of it, and they make these very tiny dots. And it took me all day to do a piece of cloth that was probably 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters.
Gosh. Yeah.
So I won't be making 12 meters.
No. I mean, what is it generally that they are presumably they're working to commission to a great extent. What is it that they're making? I know you mentioned wedding dresses, but, are there other things that they're commissioned to make?
I think they're still commissioned to make kimonos. Uh,
Right.
uh, I think genuinely, because I think they are still very popular, and certainly you see people wearing them. I
Mm.
don't think they make stitch resist for much else. Obviously, some touristy things, but
Yeah.
I think the serious work still goes on. I know Taka makes large pieces of cloth that get sold to merchants who then sell it on. So it is still considered to be a special thing.
Do they do resist on anything other than cloth? I mean, do they do paper or anything like that?
Not really. Well, I didn't see any.
Mm.
I didn't see any. I've done not so much stitching, but I've done a lot of paper in indigo where it's been clamped and folded. That works really well, particularly if you choose the right sort of paper. there's a very nice Japanese tissue paper, which you would think would be quite fragile, but is actually not very fragile. And that you can get some really spectacular results with that.
I noticed when I was looking on your site that you often use over dyeing as a technique. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You mean over dyeing when I use stitch resist?
Well, sort of over dyeing when you've been using vintage fabrics.
So yes, that started with, again, when my mother died and I went through her stuff. She used to do these I think everybody did them, where you'd buy a cotton tablecloth and it had an image printed on it, which you embroidered.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yes, and they were usually in the corner, and they were either budgerigars or crinoline ladies or things like that. And I found a lot of these because I can remember her doing them. I also found a lot of that sort of vintage fabric in charity shops, and I wanted to use them in some way. So I started stitch resisting and then putting them into indigo, the same as I did other things. And I probably use more vintage fabric now than I do make my own dyed fabric. I'm starting to use more of my own dyed fabric, but I've just come back from Germany, and my German friend, Brunhilde, has given me a big pile of fabrics that came from her grandmother. And some of them are so beautiful. So I'll be using those. I'll dye some of them, but I'll use them as they are and put them into indigo.
Before you do it, do you have an idea in your mind as to what you expect, or is it more that you see what happens and then work with that?
With regard to the stitch resist, I always know what I'm going to do. I always have an idea of what I'm going to do. So to a degree, I can predict the outcome. The element of uncertainty comes with the hand stitching that is added at the end. And then it's more or less, if I say I start and the piece of work really, it almost talks and says what it wants, and then my hands take over. And a lot of the time, I don't even really think about it. It just happens.
Right.
That's the only way I can describe it. And it's such a lovely process for me. I absolutely love doing it.
Beforehand, sort of right at the beginning of the process, you say that you always know what you're going to do. Is that because you've actually done some designs and you're working from those? How do you sort of originate what you're going to do?
A lot of the time I work with circles.
Mm.
So if I think, yes, I'm going to use circles, and of course the way I stitch resist them, you can get completely different results. So that would come into it as well, the way you actually stitch resist them, because there are so many different ways you can do it.
But you don't have a sort of an exact design drawn out somewhere that you're working to? No.
No.
Mm.
No. It has to be evolving. It's a simple, I suppose the starting point, I might think about if I was going to dye the fabric, I would think about what colour do I want underneath it? What's my colour going to be? Like a couple of years ago, it'll be 2 years this year, I had a heart attack.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine. And it came out of the blue. I hadn't been unwell or anything. And that inspired me. I'm doing 2 pieces of work, and I dyed the fabric with cochineal, and then I've stitch resisted hearts, and then I'm hand stitching them. And one of them is just covered in, well, I've called it all the things I keep in my heart. That inspired me. And the other one has got just stitching on it, which is not writing, which again came from that experience of the heart attack, having the stents fitted, my time in the hospital. So, that's really how I work. It all sounds a bit chaotic, doesn't it?
Well, part of the reason that I always tend to ask is because we spend a lot of time, as I'm sure you know, because you've done City and Guilds, telling students, well, you must plan this beforehand, because if you don't
Ooh.
plan it, you're going to make a mistake somewhere along the line. So I just wondered whether, obviously after having done the City and Guilds, if you were actually still doing that, or if you felt
Okay.
confident enough not to need to.
Well, if I now put my hand up and say that for my sitting guilds, I would do all the work. I'd make all the samples. I'd have an idea, and I'd do the what if, and then I would hand it in, and then Ruth would say to me, "And where is the plan? Where is?" And I would have to do it retrospectively, I'm afraid. Because, of
Yes.
course, for City and Guilds, you have to show it.
Yes, you do. Yes.
Yes, you do. And I'm ashamed to say I did that with everything that I did. I just don't find having a plan in that way works for me. I do the what ifs, but I do it with work.
You see, I think we tend to always ask, as you say, City and Guilds require it, but we find that it cuts down on mistakes being made if someone's obviously planned it beforehand. I think you
Yes.
need to have quite a very artistic flair in order not to do that, because you need to be confident, don't you, that whatever happens, whatever happy accident happens, you can turn that into something that's going to be
Yes.
amazing. Clearly,
Yes.
you're able to
But
do that.
I think for me, genuinely, I think I never minded how many mistakes I made,
Mm,
because I view the mistakes as part of the what if. And to say I didn't write anything down is not true, because I did write things down, especially if things went awfully, badly wrong. If I thought, oh, that's really awful. But planning is not one of the things I do. I have a rough plan, but
yes.
it's not a very focused plan, and it very quickly gets put to the back as soon as I start going in the, well, what if? I just feel confident enough that it will be okay.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? I think certainly as far as some of our students are concerned, they would be very worried if they were told, "Well, just make it up as you go along." I think they
Yes.
almost need that as a little bit of a prop,
Yeah.
so that they can. And I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that many will come to it the opposite way round, even though we don't necessarily see that process unfolding. And they
No, and
will.
and also, honestly, I think if I went back and was talking to my younger self, I would probably actively encourage me to make plans, to write things down. But it doesn't now. The way I work is not. I can't. What was the phrase you used? It doesn't. It certainly isn't. Oh, well, I haven't got a plan. I'll just do that, or I'll just do that. I have a plan, but I don't write it down.
Yes, yeah, no, I understand. I think as well, that people perhaps if they're very underconfident, which they often are if they're just starting to do City and
Of
Guilds,
course. Yes.
they need that little bit. And also, of course, if you have a plan, as you say, it's something you can share with your tutor, and then you can
Yes.
discuss if any adjustments are need making together.
Yes. And when I think back, I think Ruth Collins particularly was incredibly patient with me.
Mhm.
I mean, I think she could always see the vision, and she did try to keep me, from going too far over there, but she did let me have quite a free rein, and maybe she recognised that I didn't need to be kept in, in the way that you're talking about, and I don't mean kept in an awful way, but I think you're absolutely right. Some people need that, whereas I don't think I did.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think maybe, and I think I was lucky that she was able to say, okay, and there were times when she said, no, stop.
Mm. Yeah.
Stop.
Sometimes as tutors we have to do that, don't we? Sometimes you're saying
Yes,
to some people
exactly.
stop, and you're saying to others, come on, step
Yes,
forward,
and
give me your
sometimes,
ideas. Mm.
she would say, okay, and now on reflection, and I think with my experience with students, sometimes you have to let them go just so they make the mistake, because they're not listening to you. And sometimes I will say, okay, if you think it will work that way, please try, even though
Yes.
it won't work that way.
Yes. Yes, been
Because
there, done
you
that.
do learn by your mistakes, don't you?
You do. I think perhaps for me the most difficult thing is, as you say, you can almost see it coming down the line that that's going to create an issue. But if someone's very enthusiastic about it, then that alone might carry them through if they
Yeah.
feel enthused about the piece. But it is hard to step back if you can see them possibly you can see a pitfall that they're going to drop into. And yet, as you say, one one pitfall in that way can teach you more from experiential learning than 20 items going perfectly from beginning to end.
Yes, and I feel too that the only time you ever need to really step in is when you can see, if you do that, you're going to ruin that piece.
Yes. Yeah.
And it doesn't happen very often, but I think sometimes it can. And you think, if you carry on going down that road, you won't be able to pull it back. And that's quite difficult, isn't it? To say to somebody,
It is.
no,
It is. I think sometimes it's stopping at the right point, because it's very easy to go in and overwork something.
yes,
It's also because obviously sort of all embroidery items, none of them are really terribly cheap. So there is a
no,
cost implication for students in that
yeah,
if you can
yeah.
see them about to make what could be a really difficult mistake on something very expensive, then I think probably I would step in, because I would be aware that, you're about to ruin a piece of linen that's perhaps cost £50.
And all the work that you've put into it,
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it can be one of the things that puts people off finishing their course. If the first piece they make is a bit of a nightmare, and we all, well, I can only speak personally, but I've certainly had pieces like that. There just seem to be ones that will never go right. I don't know if you've
yeah.
experienced that.
Yes, I have. And
Yeah.
when I was working with Leslie, obviously, one of the things we did at the beginning of a day when people came regularly once a month was we showed pieces that we were working on, things that we were doing. And I had been doing this piece and I overworked it. I overworked it. And Leslie said to me, can I use this piece? And I said, yeah, of course you can. And she used to hold it up and say, this is an overworked piece. And I
Mm.
think it was really good for everybody to see, because one of the problems was, people, if they see all your lovely finished pieces, they think you don't make mistakes. They
Yes.
think you don't overwork things. I don't even know what happened to it, but I don't know what was going on in my head. I think, oh, if it's not going right, just stitch it more,
Yes.
until this poor piece of work.
I think that's what everybody thinks. If it's not going right, if I put a bit more on it, it'll
Yeah.
suddenly be better.
Or you add
Unfortunately,
something,
yeah.
and you think, oh, why did I do that? What was that for?
I have a clear memory when I think back to doing my diploma. in embroidery, and I had planned it to a fair extent, a piece that had a piece of slumped glass that I'd made underneath, and it was a sort of an Indian style with lots of sort of, it was an onion dome and it was over embroidered. But what I hadn't realised until I took it into class was when you stood back from it, that three of the features really stood out, three of the shapes, and it looked as though it was smiling. It had two eyes and a mouth. It was something that I had not even considered for a second. I just placed various symbols in various places, but a combination of the stitching and the colours had just made it look as though it had a big grin. I know.
And I think also when we're trying to finish something, that comes into play as well, because then I think, especially if you've got a deadline, I used to find then sometimes I'd make really ridiculous mistakes because I wanted it finished. But
yeah,
yes,
it's
but we
not
all
always a
learn.
smooth path, is it, creativity?
No, not at all. But that's one of the great things about it, I think.
It is. So just going back a little bit, Jude. I mean, I've just sort of been thinking, when you had your heart attack, that must have been very much during the COVID period, was it?
It was after, so it will be 2 years this year since I had the heart attack. And genuinely, when COVID came, the first lockdown, probably like many people, I really struggled. I found it really difficult because I went from, I would leave here on Monday, go to work in Tandridge and come back on Friday. So I was gone from Monday to Friday. I taught abroad. So I taught in Italy, I taught in Germany. So I was all over the place. And suddenly I had to be at home. And I found it really, really, really hard. And I think I was very, very stressed out. I was probably quite stressed out anyway. And the first lockdown went all right. And then, like a lot of people, like we started off with 2 dogs, and by the end of the second lockdown, we had no dogs left.
Oh dear.
Because they were quite elderly. That was quite hard.
Yeah.
And I think I struggled creatively, although I did get my head round it, and I did an online workshop for textileartist.org. That was quite interesting. And I think it was just a build-up. It was just a build-up of lots of things going on. It was a very strange time for everybody.
It was, and it's strange because when I talk to people about it, I get 2 very distinct views. Some people say, well, we wouldn't want it again, but actually it was fantastic because we got so much done. We were forced, obviously, to stay in one place, and it was a very creative time. Others have just found it really, really hard. I think for everybody, in either case, it probably changed a lot going forward. I think it changed probably the way that people were able to access or see work, because so much went online.
Yes, I think it was a very creative time for me in amongst all of this, because I have a studio in the garden, which was my salvation. I would get up, walk up the garden, and I'd be at work. So I had to change the way I thought about things. And then I worked only with what was around me. I did a lot of eco printing. I did a small video for Festival of Quilts of eco printing, but it also caused me to rethink how I was living my life and how I was so busy, because it's always a fine balance between being busy and being creative. And if you tip it too far one way, you lose your creativity. And I've seen it happen to people, and it's very difficult to get it back. And then it's like being in the wilderness. And
Absolutely.
I think I was in danger of that before COVID, where everything was becoming hard work for me.
In
And
terms of the inspiration for the work that you were doing or feeling enthused about it?
both, I think. I think both. And I did keep to deadlines, but I'm sure you've experienced this. You make a piece of work, especially if you've got a deadline, and it isn't exactly how you wanted it to be, but you've got the deadline there, and you think, okay, but there's a slight unhappiness about it, and a lot of the time it was like, well, yes, I've got to do that, but something was being lost because I was so busy.
Yes.
Which I think happens to a lot of people.
Oh, I
If you
think
get
it does. Yes, and also I think people that aren't involved in the creative industry don't really realise. I'm always amazed when I speak to people. They seem to think that my job consists of just basically sitting by the fire, sewing something. Um, yes, and anyone that is has a little chuckle as you've just done. But really, so much of it goes on to actually running your business. You know, the nuts and bolts of having to do
yes,
accounts, having to, obviously move outwards to find clients, to actually, I suppose, just keep the workings. I mean, social media, all of that takes a lot of time, doesn't it?
yes, and it's always about the balance, because up until probably 18 months ago, I did absolutely nothing on social media, nothing.
Mm.
I was really resistant to it. No, but now I can begin to see the advantage of it, but it takes a lot of time.
It does creating or having immediately to hand things that you can post, because often you'd want to put a photograph up, or it's hard to know, isn't it? And hard to
Yes.
always have something new there that you can do that with.
Yes, and if you're not careful, you can feel under pressure. "Oh, I haven't posted anything for, you know, 3 days. What am I going to put up?" And I've not allowed myself to go down that road. If I haven't posted anything, I haven't posted anything.
Mm.
It and some of my friends are much, much better than I am, but what surprised me was I went from having, like, 10 followers to I saw the numbers grow, and
Yeah.
that can be quite addictive too.
Oh, it can. Yes, it can. It's also very uplifting to think that what you're putting out, what you're sharing with people is being appreciated, I think.
Yes, and I think it's the same as I can remember the first piece of work I sold, and the feeling that somebody wanted to buy a piece of work that I'd made, and how
Yes.
wonderful was that?
Yeah.
No,
Mm.
it's so, I don't know, I can't quite describe it. It reinforces what you believe about yourself. It's a really lovely thing, isn't it?
It is. I believe that you work with a gallery, Gallery 35 in Cranbrook.
Yes,
Um,
they're reasonably new.
mhm.
They've been going about 2 years, and it was very nice that they asked me, and it's nice working with a gallery, but again, you can feel under pressure.
Do you have do you just supply them with pieces as and when, or do you have an exhibition that's just yours? How does that work?
Well, no, they have a lot of artists there, and I get on very well with the gallery owner, and she's very good. She doesn't put pressure on me to come up with new work. And if I've got new work, I will email her and say, okay, shall we change some work over? And I know there are periods when my work is not up because she rotates things round,
Mm.
but it works well for both of us. I've had solo exhibitions in other galleries, and It was fine, but there's a lot of pressure,
Yes.
and what they take, the percentage that they take can be quite hard, because this gallery, I mean, it's gone now. It was in Folkestone, and they took 45%.
Right.
And I think when you're pricing your work, you know the level that is good for you. We had a discussion about it, and she just put 45% on the prices. And I knew that I wouldn't sell anything. I just knew, because they were overpriced, and it was a little bit disheartening. It was very nice to see a whole gallery of my work, but it was a little bit disheartening not to sell anything.
Yes,
And then
no,
you've
I'm
got
sure.
and then you've got the problem afterwards that the gallery doesn't want you to sell it cheaper. They don't want you to
Yes.
sell it cheaper. So what do you do? And luckily for me, a little bit further down the line, the gallery closed. So I was able to do what I like with the work. But a lot of the work that I did for that gallery, I took it out of its frames and reworked it. Worked it in a different way, because that was the other thing. Everything was framed, which was quite a lot of money.
Yes.
So I'm a little bit cautious about galleries. It's nice if they want your work, but you have to be quite careful.
Do you work to commission ever, Jude? Is that something that you would consider? Or?
I have done it in the past, but I didn't really enjoy the process. It's the same as I've worked with groups. I've been in groups, and I struggled quite a lot with working to a theme, and it felt the same way working to a commission. And I only ever did it once, and I was asked for 3 pieces of work, and it took me probably 4 times the length of time that it would normally take me to make a piece of work. And it was fine, but the money that I received from it did not cover the length of time that I'd spent doing it. So I decided that I wouldn't do commissions again.
No, it's a tough thing to do, isn't it? Working to somebody else's brief is hard.
And the lady that asked me to do the work, she wasn't fussy. She didn't constantly say, "Oh, I don't like this." I just found it incredibly difficult to just start sometimes. And I didn't want to make a facsimile, because it was based on a piece of work that she saw.
Oh, I see.
So the piece of work that she saw was sold, and she wanted 4 pieces of work like this piece of work. And it was just incredibly hard. So I thought, I'm not doing that again. It's not for me.
No, I can fully understand that. I think some people obviously seem to quite enjoy it, but others, it's just as you say, it's not for them, and they find it very, very hard to get the inspiration.
Yes.
And just dealing with the process as well, because you're having to almost let somebody into your creative process, aren't you? Because you must have to show them at different times how it's progressing and whatnot.
Yes, and for me, one of the most difficult things was progress was incredibly slow, and the client was really, really patient. But halfway through, I thought, I wish I hadn't accepted this, because I'm just not enjoying it. It didn't feel very creative to me in the end. It just didn't.
I understand. Yeah. So, what's next? I mean, do you have any exhibitions or book or anything coming up?
I have an exhibition that I'm doing in 2 weeks' time in Tenterden. I used to be part of a group that ran a gallery. We ran a gallery in Tenterden, and obviously the gallery closed. As soon as it started to be successful, the landlord put the rent up.
Oh dear. And I actually know Tenterden quite well, because it's
Oh, do you?
it's very close to where my husband's auntie lives. So we go down to, she lives in Sevenoaks, so we tend to go down a couple of times a year to visit.
It's a lovely place. I don't know if you know, I don't even know if it's still there now, where there was a charity shop up a little corridor.
Mm.
And at the end of it, he used to be a framer, a picture framer. And he left and we took it on as a gallery, and there were 6 of us, and we were not for profit. So, it was really nice, and it was a very nice space. But as soon as we started getting anywhere, he put the rent up, and then it just wasn't viable anymore.
What a shame.
So I'm exhibiting there in 3 weeks' time, and there's a St Mildred's Village Hall, it's the church hall, I think. It's quite a nice little show, and they have different people every 2 years. So I'm doing that, and I've booked a gallery space for next year to do a solo exhibition. But that's as far as I've got. I've got some teaching commitments. I'm off to Germany again at the end of November.
Oh, wonderful.
So a few things, but I try not to get too busy.
Yes.
Because I need some time for the what ifs.
Yes, of course. Yeah, no, I
Yes.
understand that. And as you say, it's very hard to get that balance between finding enough time to be creative yourself, but as you say, obviously when you make things, there is you do want to get out there and share them with the public, and it's hard to find that balance.
Yeah, so I think the heart attack really helped me think about balance, and I do work quite hard.
Yes.
Not to get too committed, and I do turn things down. I was invited to exhibit in Benenden, which is quite near to Tenterden, and I thought, I've taken on too much if I take this on, so I said no. But I said, consider me for next year. And the other thing is, as you get older, I think you do have to look after your health a bit more.
Absolutely, yes. And I think there's also, I know myself, as I get older, you do start to think, well, do I really want to do that? Do I really want to put myself under that level of pressure in a way that I wouldn't have done when I was younger?
Yes, I try to do things that excite me and things that I know that I'll really enjoy. And if I start to not enjoy something, then I stop doing it.
Yeah, I
Because
think we've
what's the
earned
point?
that,
What's
haven't
the
we?
point? Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
I think we've earned it.
Definitely.
Well, Jude, thank you so much for joining me today. I honestly can't believe where the time's gone.
I know.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me, and I've enjoyed it.